Welcome to Down to Business with V, a show dedicated to bringing you actionable information to help protect you, your families, your businesses, and the community. I'm your host V, and today we're discussing the psychological impact of cybercrimes on victims. We're bringing in the director for the National Center for Victims of Crime to help bring awareness to this issue. You don't want to miss it. Let's get down to business.
From Atlanta, Georgia, to becoming a United States Marine, to Washington, D.C., and every place in between, everybody calls me V. My goal is to bring you resources, education, and knowledge from sources you can trust that informs and protects to safeguard our families, our businesses, and the community. Now let's get down to business.
Welcome to Down to Business with V, a show dedicated to bringing you actionable information to help protect you, your families, your businesses, and your community. I'm your host V, and today we are discussing the psychological impacts of cybercrimes on victims. And today we have in the studio with us again, Rachel Gibson. She is the director of the Center for Victim Service Professionals at the National Center for Victims of Crime. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you for having me again.
Thank you so much for being here. So Rachel, a lot of times the public perception is that cybercrime is low impact because it's not a violent crime. However, the victims of cybercrimes experience a lot of the same effects felt by victims of violent street crimes. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those psychological impacts and what these victims might be experiencing in their day-to-day life?
Sure. So many times victims are experiencing PTSD. They're experiencing a lot of the same traumatic responses that someone who has experienced violent crime or other types of crime have experienced. And what we know to be true about trauma is that it can be two people can experience the same sort of situation and have very different reactions. I always think about in terms of financial fraud, right? Many times victims of financial fraud are feeling vulnerable, are feeling like they should have known better. And the weight of losing your fortune or your money can be a toll on victims. And so when we think about how victims of cybercrime are processing really traumatic events, it can manifest in a lot of different ways. They often feel guilty for being victims. They often feel like they should have known better. When we think about too, in terms of the demographics of folks who might be experiencing certain types of crimes, so older adults who were susceptible to an investment scam or financial fraud may feel shame because they feel like they're older, they should be wiser, they should have known better. When we think about victims of sexual assault who maybe experienced the sexual assault in person, but then have to go and see their story being refuted online, or their campus community telling them that they should have known better. Why did I wear that skirt? Why did I go to that party? I shouldn't have been drinking. And so they are experiencing a lot of different emotions and reactions to what has happened to them. And so we know that studies have shown since 2020 and this pandemic that we lived in, there was some research done that 90% of victims in this particular research were victims of human error, breaches, data breaches, that cybercrime, or that we know that during the pandemic that cyber threats have gone up 30,000%. And so anyone can be a victim of this, and the way in which they process that trauma, that emotional turmoil can range from a lot of different actions and coping mechanisms.
Rachel, that's all super insightful information and very impactful. I think what you just shared will definitely help our audience understand what family members might be going through that have been victims, or validate what they themselves, if they've been victims, are going through. Can you share a little bit more about the secondary effects that come along with this type of thing? In some cases, not being believed, things like that.
Sure. And we see this play out regardless of technology, right? One of the mantras of the victim services, the anti-violence movement, is to start by believing. And especially when we think about how technology plays a part in this, many victims I worked with said, I reported it to police, I reported it to someone, and they said, that can't happen, or that I don't believe it. And really, it's not our job to say what can and cannot happen, but it is our job as community members, as partners, as friends to believe that person and then find someone who can help them. And so oftentimes we'll see victims not wanting to report that they have been victims of crime because they're afraid they won't be believed, they won't be taken seriously. Um, Oftentimes victims who are experiencing violence online will say, well, it's online, somebody, I don't know where to report, or I don't know who's going to believe this, or it's their word against mine. But again, that level of not believing folks, just it plays out all over crime victimization, not just in the cyber world. But when we add that cyber component piece, that even makes it more difficult for people to get the help and the resources that they need, because people can't fathom that the technology can do it. I know a lot of times when victims think about if they've been a victim of stalkerware, and how someone can gain access to your computer, your keystrokes being logged, what sites you visited. Many people don't know that that is actually possible, given some of the technology that is out there. And so when victims say, hey, I'm being followed, hey, this person knows where I'm at, hey, they're showing up and I didn't tell them, we really have to honor what that person is saying and believe them that they are experiencing that, because we know that many times victims, again, the one time that they choose to report or talk to someone, and if they don't get a supportive, reassuring, empathetic reaction, that might be the only time that they report. And so we have to really think critically about that. We often hear in this sort of crime as well a lot of victim blaming, right? Again, they should have known better. If you hadn't posted it online, you wouldn't have had this happen to you. And it's important for us to remember again that this is the behavior that someone else chose to do and not the fault of the victim. And so we have to think about that clearly. And then when we think about too how someone is experiencing this and seeing their most intimate moments, say they're a victim of non-consensual intimate images or revenge porn, right? So their most intimate moments being shared online. I always tell people that the internet and technology, social media is like the city of New York. It doesn't sleep. So not only am I experiencing the violence or abuse or whatever else in my day-to-day life, then I go online and it's there for the world to see without an off switch. And so it's important that when we're talking to victims, we're talking to our community members, we're talking to friends and family who might be experiencing this, that we validate these sorts of feelings of shame, these feelings of guilt, these feelings of being robbed of their life. We have to validate that and we have to honor that. And again, if we don't know where to send somebody to, we send them to victim service resources in our community or folks that can help them.
Rachel, you touched on some very, very important key points. One of them being when a victim reports, whether it's to a friend or family member or someone that they trust, hearing the statement, how could that happen? Or I don't know how that could happen. Or that only happens on TV or in movies. Mm-hmm. And those statements and that concept is one that we're trying to completely, utterly annihilate and destroy, because these things are happening to real people in real life on a day-to-day basis. Exactly. These aren't things that just happen in the movies. You also talked about stalkerware, which is huge. We did a show on stalkerware and sort of shed some light on what its capabilities are and how it's used to target citizens. What I love is that you said it's not our responsibility to understand how it happens. But it is our responsibility to believe a victim, which is hugely important. That was one of the things that I took from our initial conversation, is that believing them is the most important step in helping them, either, in reporting or recovery. So very, very important points. So in the 3 minutes that we have before the break, Rachel, I'd like for you to talk about just some of the things that we can do as we are, listening to our friends and family, people, whether it's employees, when they report to us, what are some of the phrases that you think a victim needs to hear, wants to hear, longs to hear in a situation like this?
Sure. So again, ultimately, it's that validating, that empathy, right? So we want to listen, and let them tell the story. Oftentimes, folks who have experienced a traumatic event, whether it be in person, online, may tell their story out of context, right? So they might start at Z and go to F, then go to A, and so that story could be all over the place. And again, it's not our job to kind of say, well, wait a minute, you started here but went there. Our job is to let them tell that story and then help them process that. Again, we don't have to be counselors. There are counselors, there are mental health folks out there that can provide that level of mental health support that the person may want or need. And so our job is to really help the person get that story out, to validate that story, and then get them connected to their local or state level resources that can help them, should they choose to do so, report, file a claim, file a criminal report. And then again, it's thinking about our own language. So even if we don't know anyone who's been a victim of crime, I see online all the time people posting things like, this person should have known better, or they didn't need to do that, right? So even if we don't know someone, we post things online, we say things in the community, and we don't know who is a victim. And so we should be mindful about the things that we say online and in person, because it could be said to a victim who's deciding whether or not they should disclose that they have been a victim or not. The other thing is, again, to help them find social support, community members, to find folks in their community who can give them resources, who can give them support. So not only does victim services, but like gatekeepers, your pastors, your preachers, your rabbis, your older adults. Those are the folks who can, again, help provide a level of social support, because a lot of times in cases where maybe it's elder abuse or romance scams, they're banking on the fact that that person does not have a community around them, that they do not have social support, that they do not have folks in their life who will rally them. And so, making sure they're connected to their friends, their family, their community organizations will also be helpful. And then I think lastly, thinking about self-care and what that means. Self-care is going to look different for everyone, but providing them that ability to kind of step away if they want to, or even still stay engaged if they want to, and figuring out ways in which they can process what they've experienced so that they can feel empowered and feel like they can take control back of their lives.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. Very, very impactful, insightful, and very informative. When we come back from the break, we'll discuss more about the psychological impacts of cybercrimes on victims. We'll have Rachel sharing more. We'll be back.
Every organization is responsible for ensuring cybersecurity. The ability to protect its information systems from impairment or even theft is essential to success. Implementing effective security measures will not only offer liability protection, it will also increase efficiency and productivity. With our cybersecurity workshop, your participants will understand the different types of malware and security breaches. Develop effective prevention methods which will increase overall security. They'll also understand the basic concepts associated with cybersecurity and what a company needs to stay secure.
Find out more about training for you and your organization at vicargroup.com.
Every year, millions of Americans fall victim to crime. At the National Center for Victims of Crime, we believe that every single victim deserves the support they need on their healing journey. We provide assistance to victims across the nation for every type of crime so that they can recover from the emotional, physical, and financial costs of their experience. But we need your help in this work. Find out more about the National Center and how you can help victims of crime by visiting victimsofcrime.org.
Welcome back to Down to Business with V. I'm your host, V, and today we are discussing the psychological impacts of cybercrimes on victims. I have in the studio with me Rachel Gibson. She is the director of the Center for Victim Service Professionals at the National Center for Victims of Crime. Welcome again, Rachel.
Thank you.
Rachel, for those that are just tuning in to the show and maybe missed the first part of the show where we talked about some of the psychological impacts, can you just recap a little bit what some of those are?
Sure. So because the internet or technology is involved does not mean that the crime and the experience that someone has is any less traumatic, any less harmful, any less hurtful. And so victims of these sorts of crime can experience PTSD. They can experience substance abuse. They can experience fear and shame. So there are, cases in which victims of cyber crimes are experiencing similar reactions to their victimization, like those who are experiencing violent crimes or other types of crimes as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Some of the other things that were mentioned in one study, I think it was done by Dutch law enforcement actually, was that their victims in the study that they did felt a loss of self-confidence. They also lost trust in certain systems, whether it was online banking in the case of cyber fraud having to do in the banking sector, or losing trust in people.
Yes. Yes.
When things like that happen. So can you talk to us a little bit more about some of those, which are, elements of post-traumatic stress?
Mm-hmm.
So talk to us a little bit more about that and what victims might be feeling as a result of what they've experienced.
Right. So the loss of trust in the system and systems is understandable, right? You believe that this system, who was created by super smart people in Silicon Valley or wherever, have created a system that is foolproof. And when that system fails, it can be heartbreaking. And many times victims begin to not trust themselves. Well, I should have known better. You'll see self-blaming. How did I fall prey to this? What could I have done differently? And that's not right. They were victims of a crime. Someone, again, chose to do this to them. And so, that trust not only in the system of the online system, but also the trust in themselves, the mistrust of themselves happens. Thinking about someone who may have had posts written about them online, or their intimate images shown on a pornography website, and you think, oh great, I've gotten it taken down from one site, but then it could be sent and shared on thousands of other sites. And so for many victims, it feels overwhelming. It feels like there is no end, there is no real justice with cyber crimes because of the way in which it can be is shared globally, worldwide. You don't know who has had access, say, to your intimate images. You don't know, not only maybe if you're a victim of financial fraud, that person has that one bank account information, they may have other account information. Maybe you've saved up your entire life only to find out that when you invested in this scam company, your retirement is no longer available and you're supposed to retire in 2 or 3 years. And so a lot of times we see that mistrust of self and mistrust of the system happening because victims are experiencing this. And then thinking about too a mistrust in the criminal justice system, because we know with cyber crimes often it takes a really long time to get prosecution. So someone may have to get their computer or their cell phone sweep. Then they have to find the evidence. And maybe that was posted on one certain website today, but it was deleted. And so then law enforcement has to get a special court order to get that information pulled again. And so it is a tedious process. And oftentimes victims are not given the updated information about what happens. Oftentimes, if you report to certain federal sites, you might report it and you don't even get an email back. And so then you're sitting there wondering, well, what's happening with my case? Is something going on? And so we see a lot of times where there's that mistrust in the criminal justice system because of the tedious nature of what a prosecution could look like.
Yeah, you talked about the reporting of cyber crimes. One of the things that some law enforcement shared with me is that sometimes in the reporting of a cybercrime, it happens across state lines. So the victim might be in one state, the perpetrator is in another, and then they're having to collaborate across state lines with investigators to pull the case together. So that definitely will impact. But also, one of the things that we heard from victims in this study that was conducted was that providing updates and feedback on where their case was, what was happening as a result of their reports, was hugely important in their ability to recover and their confidence in reporting. So very, very interesting that you touched on both of those issues. One of the other things that we wanted to kind of recap and reiterate in this segment for those that might have missed it in the first segment is believing the victim and how important that is. So very briefly, can you touch on that again for those that are just joining us or might have missed it?
Sure. Start by believing. It's simple, but it's so difficult for people. But it really is simple to start by believing. Even if you don't understand what's happening, it is okay. But you need to believe that that person is experiencing something. One of the things I often hear from folks is, oh, that person is having a mental health crisis. There's no way that can happen. And while, yes, that cybercrime might be traumatic enough that that person may want to seek mental health services, saying that someone is experiencing something and that they're crazy, that couldn't possibly happen, devalues what that person is saying. And I have had many victims reach out to me and said, well, my grandchildren think I'm crazy, but I know something's going on. I feel it. And maybe there isn't anything going on, but slowing down and saying, I hear you, I validate you, and let's think it through can be really helpful for someone. And it could be life or death for victims. For victims experiencing intimate partner violence or domestic violence, it could be life or death when it means that someone doesn't or chooses not to believe them. And then lastly, thinking about too, that believing doesn't always mean that we have to have the answers. So we can, as community members and support, say, yes, I believe you, I hear you, I honor what you're saying. Now let's find an expert. Let's find someone in our community like law enforcement, like victim service professionals, like private investigators who can help us figure out what's going on and get you some help and support and recourse that you deserve.
So important, Rachel. And let's not fail to mention your organization, the National Center for Victims of Crime, a great starting point. If someone's in a situation like this, they're experiencing some type of cybercrime, they don't know where to start, either with reporting or to get help, your organization has so many resources to help victims across the board, whether it's from a legal standpoint, from a healthcare standpoint, reporting standpoint. There are so many resources there. And I want to thank you and your organization for the work you do every day in that area. It's huge. It's huge. And I think will have a huge impact on victims, helping them recover and get through just some of the trauma that's surrounding the issue. So, Rachel, before we close out, in the few minutes that we have remaining, talk to us about the different types of reporting and what those are, and then how a victim or someone that has a loved one who's experienced this can report.
Sure. And I think about reporting in a couple of different ways. So first, everyone thinks about criminal report, right? Have I reported it to law enforcement? But what we know to be true for many victims is that actually may not be safe. For victims of intimate partner violence, that could be critical in their safety of life or death. We know that victims, as soon as they decide to leave and report, that escalates the violence in their life. So yes, there is the ability to report to law enforcement, and that might be great for some victims because it does allow for a criminal investigation to happen, but that may not be the best option for every victim. The second way to do that is to just report to like the FTC or any of these other federal agencies if you're experiencing, say, scam calls, romance scams, those sorts of crimes that they have. The FTC has a great website where it's a very fairly simple process where you can report scam numbers and scam emails, and that they will be able to collect that information to do investigations. And then the other way to report is simply to the online account. So if you're experiencing, say, harassment, cyberbullying, online threats on a social media site, many of those social media sites have reporting mechanisms that you can go on and file a report, and they will investigate and either remove it, or if it violates their community standards, or at least get you connected to other resources. When we think about online reporting, though, it is important to note that if you report, they may take that information down. So if you are considering later pressing charges or going to the police, you may want to take a screenshot of any and all helpful information, so that if it does get reported and they get it taken down, that you have that documentation for later. And so those are the ways in which reporting can happen. Oftentimes victims say, I don't actually want a criminal recourse. I just want the thing taken down. And that's okay. We as victim service providers, as community members, again, our job isn't to decide what's best for the person, but to allow them to make the best decision for themselves. And maybe it is just having it come down. Maybe it's the peace of mind of knowing that no one else can see what's being posted, what's being shared. Maybe it's the peace of mind of knowing that that particular website or company took action and banned that person from their website. That may be enough for victims. And so that should be considered as well.
Rachel Gibson, Director of the Center for Victim Service Professionals at the National Center for Victims of Crime. Thank you so much for all of the information that you've shared today. I would encourage you, our audience, to go to the website for the National Center for Victims of Crime to either educate yourselves on some of the cyber crimes that are out there and what can be done to assist you or someone that you know that might have been impacted. I'd like to thank our guest, Rachel Gibson, Director of the Center for Victim Service Professionals at the National Center for Victims of Crime. Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing your insight and expertise with our audience today. We certainly do appreciate you. I'd also like to thank our studio and production team, Hannah, Hank, Eric, Stephen, Suzanne, and Doug. Thank you so much for all you do to make this show possible. I'd also like to thank you, last but not least, our audience, for watching. If you'd like to sponsor the show, if you'd like to be a guest on the show, or if you have ideas for the show, be sure to email us at show@dtbwithv.com. Thank you so much. Be sure to join us next time on Down to Business with V, a show that brings you actionable information to help protect you, your families, your businesses, and the community. I'm your host, V. We'll see you next time.